want to talk to you tonight about a history about the 1790s and a hyper-partisanship that almost destroyed the country. It's a story that I think people should know something about, and it's a story that surprised me. And maybe a good place to start is where the story started for me. I came across a letter that I had never heard of. The letter was written from Mount Vernon on January 15th, 1799. George Washington is in retirement. He's living under his own vine and fig tree, to use his favorite biblical allusion. On this particular January day, it was mild and sunny outside, we're told. Inside Mount Vernon, it was becoming very stormy. You can almost sense the general pacing the wide pine boards, and his anger is growing, and finally, George Washington sits down, picks up a sheaf of paper and a quill pen, and the man we know of as the sword of the American Revolution writes a long letter to a man we know of as the trumpet of the American Revolution, Patrick Henry. Now, they had not communicated for many years, but Washington now writes Patrick Henry, there is a crisis when everything dear and valuable to us is assailed. Washington goes on to rail at some people who are putting their own personal political ambitions above country and threatening the nation itself. There is a crisis which must eventually dissolve the Union or produce coercion. And by coercion, George Washington meant the U.S. Army marching on its own people. He begged Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to save the country from what he saw as a crisis. There were reports that the nation was on the verge of civil war. The nation was at risk, and he writes to Patrick Henry. Now, Patrick Henry had also been living in retirement down at Red Hill, close to the North Carolina border. He had retired after he had led the opposition to ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Patrick Henry was the leading anti-federalist. He opposed ratification of the Constitution because he thought it would create a government too powerful, too distant from the people. They had tried to bring Patrick Henry out of retirement many times. He had been offered Supreme Court Justice, Senator, Secretary of State, Ambassador to France, Ambassador to Spain. He consistently refused. He had previously told Washington that he would only come out of retirement if necessary for the safety of my country. If the nation was at risk and faced the threat of disunion. Henry receives that letter from George Washington. He writes back, I accord with every sentiment you express to me. Patrick Henry, the great anti-federalist of American history, agrees to come out of retirement to defend the Constitution that he had opposed because he believed the nation was at risk. Patrick Henry wins his election to office. Patrick Henry always wins his election. But he died before he could take his office. Had Patrick Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson almost certainly would not have been elected president in 1800. Well, who was it that was creating the crisis? Who was it that was threatening the Union? Who was it that was putting their own personal political ambition above country? It's none other than Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in the radical states' rights agenda of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Well, this was a great story. And I had never heard anything about it. I had finished my PhD in early American history. Andrew was one of my professors. Peter Onuf was my advisor. And here we have the sword of the American Revolution, the trumpet of the American Revolution, against the pen of the Revolution and the father of the Constitution. And it was a story that I had never heard about. And so I was immediately fascinated, and I wanted to answer several questions. I wanted to know first, why was Patrick Henry, the leading anti-federalist, the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, coming out of retirement in opposition to states' rights? And then I wanted to know if it's true that Thomas Jefferson would not have been elected president had Henry lived. Is there something else we need to know about Thomas Jefferson? Have we missed something about Jefferson? And then third, I wanted to know, why is this story not a bigger part of history? Why had I never heard anything about this? Is that merely historical forgetfulness, which is certainly an issue, or was maybe something more at work here? And so those are the questions I set out to answer with this research. And let's start with, why was Henry, the intellectual godfather, opposing states' rights? Well, we need to take a little bit of a step back, because we need to get to 1798 and the Alien Sedition Acts. But we might start back when George Washington is inaugurated as president in 1789. And as you'll recall, the French Revolution breaks out almost immediately. And with the French Revolution, Britain and France are going to be at war almost constantly until Waterloo in 1815. And both want the United States to support them. They want ships, they want supplies, maybe troops from the United States. And George Washington is immediately thrown into a foreign affairs crisis. And Washington realizes that the nation is too new, it's too young, it's too weak to be dragged into these European wars. And so in 1793, Washington issues the Neutrality Proclamation. We're going to stay out of these European wars. In 1795, he enters the Jay Treaty with Britain. It's not a very good treaty. Nobody likes the Jay Treaty, but it keeps the peace. By 1798, the problem is revolutionary France and a rising Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, we had sent peace negotiators to France as well, but the French foreign minister insisted on a bribe even to meet with our peace negotiators, the so-called XYZ affair. Well, this is an insult to the new nation. This is an insult to our honor. They require a bribe even to meet with the French foreign minister. And we end up in what is referred to as the quasi-war with France. Now, it's called a quasi-war, but people are being shot. People are being killed. In fact, under the quasi-war, France seized over 330 U.S. ships, and in 1798, the U.S. Congress banned trade with France, our revolutionary ally. And so this was the foreign policy situation that was presented in 1798. Now, the Federalist Party, the party of George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, they controlled the presidency, they controlled Congress. And so they responded to the quasi-war with three different steps. The first, they increased the defense budget. Right? We may end up in war with France. That makes sense. We're going to increase the defense budget. Second thing they did was they adopted the Alien Acts, dealing with alien friends, alien enemies. The third thing they did, and the most portentous, they adopted the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act literally makes it illegal to criticize the President of the United States or the U.S. Congress. By the way, you can say whatever you want about the Vice President. Who's the Vice President? Thomas Jefferson. But it's illegal to criticize the President of the United States or the Vice President. Now, historians have told us for many years that this was a mistake, it was a bad thing, but it wasn't really that very serious. One historian refers to it as paltry prosecutions. We've been told for years there were 14 prosecutions, 10 convictions. More recent historic research shows there were over 40 indictments, over 120 people were indicted, and they were targeting the Democratic Republican newspapers. They were targeting the opposition newspapers, almost as if they wanted to take off the air anyone who opposed the president. Thomas Jefferson realized this was a crisis. You can't run a republic without free speech and freedom of the press. Thomas Jefferson refers to it as a reign of witches. Jefferson writes James Madison that the Democratic Republican newspapers, if they fail, republicanism will be entirely browbeaten. He writes another supporter that to preserve freedom of the press, every spirit should be ready to devote itself to martyrdom. It was a reign of witches. It was a crisis in the still new nation. How can you have a republic without freedom of speech and freedom of the press? But what do you do? What do you do if you're Thomas Jefferson and James Madison? What do you do if you're the Democratic Republicans? Well, the way the system is supposed to work is you win the next election, right? You kick the bums out. You change the law. That's the way the system's designed, but there's a problem with that. Because of that XYZ affair, because of the quasi-war with France, we're in a foreign policy crisis. John Adams, the president, for the first and only time in his long career, is personally popular. The man has taken to wearing a sword to various public appearances because he's the commander-in-chief. So you might not be able to win an election because of the foreign affairs crisis. It wouldn't be the last time that foreign affairs interfered in domestic politics. And besides that, if they're throwing your newspaper editors in jail, how can you have a fair election? How can you win an election? So Jefferson and Madison are concerned that won't work. So what do you do? What do you do if you're Thomas Jefferson and James Madison? Well, the second option, you sue the buggers, right? I used to tell my law students, this is a great solution. You sue them. It's unconstitutional. It's a violation of the First Amendment. Now, I realize that this was about 5 years before Marbury versus Madison. They knew that the court could strike down unconstitutional laws. Thomas Jefferson had said it, James Madison had said it, Patrick Henry had said it, John Marshall had said it. But there was a problem. The law of free speech and free press was still developing. And 5 of the 6 sitting Supreme Court justices had sat on Sedition Act cases and never said a word about its constitutionality. And if you sued and you lost, then you're worse off. The Supreme Court decides that it's constitutional. So maybe that won't work. So what do you do if you're Thomas Jefferson and James Madison? Well, Jefferson came to a third solution. He was going to call upon the states to help in opposition to the federal laws. Now, this had been tried before. In fact, Patrick Henry had led the effort in Virginia in the 1790-1791 period in opposition to Alexander Hamilton's financial program, which they believed to be unconstitutional. And the Virginia General Assembly had objected and asked that their legislatures in Congress get Congress to repeal the Hamiltonian laws. But Thomas Jefferson was thinking of something far more serious than a mere protest. And Thomas Jefferson drafts the Kentucky resolutions. Now, the Kentucky resolutions say several things. They say that the United States is merely a compact of independent sovereign states, resurrecting an idea from the Confederation. Jefferson actually uses the term that a state may nullify a federal law, and that a state may declare that a federal law is null, void, of no force and effect in that state. James Madison drafts the Virginia resolutions. The Virginia resolutions are a bit weaker, but they also say the United States is merely a compact of independent sovereign states. And the problem is, if the United States is a mere compact of independent states, succession is possible. And although he later denies it, Thomas Jefferson is talking about succession. Determined were we to be disappointed in this, repeal of the Alien and Sedition Acts, to sever ourselves from the Union we so much value. Virginia is arming. Virginia is buying arms to fill a new armory in Richmond, and there are reports that it's for a possible civil war. One Virginia militia officer is quoted in the newspapers as saying, if France does invade, I will take my troops to the French banner, rather than the stars and stripes carried by a political opponent. Open treason. Open treason. This is the second crisis. This is the crisis that caused George Washington to write Patrick Henry. At least 40 newspapers report from Virginia that we're on the verge of civil war. Several of them carry the headlines, Civil War, a suspicion that a coalition is being formed for seceding from the Union. It's one of the great battles of American history, and it's largely forgotten. And it's particularly poignant that of the whole nation, George Washington asks Patrick Henry to come out of retirement to address this crisis. Henry, as I mentioned, was the leading anti-federalist. He opposed ratification of the Constitution. But he agrees at Washington's call to come out of retirement to defend that Constitution. Patrick Henry goes on March 4th, 1799 to Charlotte Courthouse to make a campaign speech. The world seems to understand this is probably Patrick Henry's last public performance. People gather from counties around. We were talking about Hampton-Sydney. The students walk from Hampton-Sydney to Charlotte Courthouse to hear Patrick Henry's final speech. Patrick Henry is, we know, suffering from the illness that will kill him 3 short months in the future. It's said when he rises to speak, he's bent, he's old. It said he has a Scottish cast to his face, a gray cast. He stooped a little from age, he seemed feeble, his voice was slightly cracked and tremulous. But as Patrick Henry began to speak to the throngs that had gathered, a wonderful transformation comes over Patrick Henry. He rises up, his voice booms out as it had into the Revolution. He tells people, Virginia has planted thorns upon my pillow. Henry has a way with words. He says that Virginia is to the federal government as Charlotte County is to Virginia. Virginia has no more right to ignore the federal laws than Charlotte County has to ignore the laws of Virginia. Such opposition on the part of Virginia to the acts of the general government must beget their enforcement by military power, civil war, foreign alliances. Henry warns the people, you will face a federal army led by George Washington. Who will dare to lift his hand against the father of his country, to point a weapon at the breast of a man who often led them to battle and to victory? Well, it's an 18th century election. People had been drinking. There's a drunk in the audience. We actually know his name. It's a fellow named John Harvey. And Patrick Henry, who would dare to lift his hand? John Harvey, I would! Henry rises up and turns on him. You dare not do it. In such a parricidal attempt, the steel will drop from your nerveless arm. It's classic Henry. Henry turns to the Alien and Sedition Act and he says, look, the people hold the reins over Congress. Congress were as much your representatives as the Virginia Assembly and had as good a right to your confidence. If the administration has done wrong, let us all go wrong together. United we stand, divided we fall. Let us not split into factions which must destroy the union upon which our existence hangs. Is the federal government too powerful? It's necessary to submit to the constitutional exercise of that power. Henry tells the people, go to the ballot box. Go to the ballot box. If we can't live within the Constitution, civil commotions and intestine wars will follow. You may bid adieu forever to representative government. You can never exchange the present government but for a monarchy. Henry reminds the people that he had opposed the Constitution, but he says, we adopted it. I didn't, I voted against it. But we the people adopted this Constitution. And if we can't live within it, the only option is monarchy. Patrick Henry understands the first rule in a democracy is the majority rules. That's an easy one. Henry understands the second and equally important rule. The minority must accept the first rule, at least until the next election. Well, as I said, Patrick Henry wins his election. He dies on June 6th before he can take office. As I said, I think had he lived, and John Randolph of Roanoke, one of the great Jeffersonians of the early 19th century, he says, had Patrick Henry lived, Thomas Jefferson would never have been elected president. This then, though, leads to that second question. Have we misunderstood Jefferson? Is there something about Jefferson that maybe we ought to understand? Because, you know, the conventional wisdom is that you get the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, you get the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and then in 1800, Jefferson's elected president, as if one follows the other, one after the other. Akil Omar at Yale says, the first opportunity to weigh in on the matter, the U.S. citizens elected Thomas Jefferson as president. One follows the other. But this is highly misleading. You see, they had midterm elections too. And in the midterm election, after Jefferson's Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, take a shellacking in the midterm. To give you an example, in the Deep South, the Federalist Party went from 4 members of Congress to 12. In Virginia, the Federalist Party went from 4 members of Congress to 8. And much worse from Jefferson's perspective, among the new Federalist members of Congress are John Marshall and Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee. Both of them major Jefferson opponents. And both of them owed their election to the support of Patrick Henry. I've often wondered in the years that go by whether when Jefferson's fighting with John Marshall, he thinks this is Patrick Henry's fault. And after that election, when the Democratic Republicans took a shellacking, Jefferson said he was surprised. He says that the language astonished everyone. But it didn't really astonish anyone other than Jefferson. Joseph Cabell, Some of you will recognize that name. Cabell says that the Democratic Republicans lost because of the fear of disunion. That it sounded like the Democratic Republicans were preaching disunion. And it's not just the election in Virginia and in the Deep South. 10 of the 16 states respond to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and expressly denounce them, disagree with them. But here's the interesting part. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison do something interesting. They do something that we would like our politicians to do. They realized they had made a mistake. And they backpedaled. And they backpedaled strong and hard to avoid that idea of nullification. They realized they had gone too far. And historians have largely missed this. I came across another interesting letter. This letter is written from James Madison to Thomas Jefferson 8 days after the Virginia resolutions are adopted. Now let's stop for a moment. Virginia resolutions, they're drafted by James Madison, every word. The Virginia resolutions are much weaker than the Kentucky resolutions, but they still say that it's a compact of independent states. 8 days after those Virginia resolutions are adopted, Madison is writing Jefferson saying, maybe we went too far. Madison says this, it is to be feared their zeal. He's blaming the Virginia General Assembly for adopting his resolutions. He says, their zeal may forget some considerations which ought to temper their proceedings. We will be accused of usurpation in the very act of protesting against the usurpations of Congress. We've gone too far. In fact, in 1798 and 1799, the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, had basically been begging the Federalists to prosecute somebody in the South. Because all of those prosecutions under the Sedition Act I was talking about, they had all occurred north of the Potomac. And they were begging them, prosecute somebody in the South and see what happens. In Virginia, there was a law introduced which would have given a state court judge the ability to issue habeas corpus against a federal prisoner. Now think about that for a minute. You're indicted by the grand jury, the federal grand jury, the federal marshals put you in jail, a state judge sends an armed sheriff to get you out of federal custody. They were basically begging them, try a prosecution in the South. By 1800, they changed their tune. There is a prosecution in the South. James Callender, another name that some of you may recognize, he will become famous or infamous a few years later for exposing the Sally Hemings relationship with Thomas Jefferson. James Callender writes the prospect before us, which interestingly, by the way, quotes Patrick Henry in the front cover. Henry's dead. It's now safe to quote him as a Jeffersonian. Talking about the Constitution, it has an awful squinting. It squints at monarchy. James Callender is put in jail in Richmond. And James Monroe, the new governor of Virginia, writes both Jefferson and Madison and basically says, don't do anything stupid. I'm paraphrasing. But Monroe writes them and says, we can't be talking about states' rights. We can't be talking about nullification. He says that by a perfect obedience to this law, we will be shown to be in the right without threat of disunion. We have to talk about freedom of the press. That will become a burden to themselves, to the Federalists and the Sedition Act. The idea of nullification is tabled. We don't hear any more talk about that until it explodes over Fort Sumter. But what about President Jefferson? When Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated as president, almost immediately, pundits, and then for 200 years, historians have accused Thomas Jefferson of hypocrisy because Thomas Jefferson as president does not do the things that Thomas Jefferson had said he would do in the 1790s. But there's another explanation other than hypocrisy. He may have realized they went too far. he may have realized the hyper-partisanship of the 1790s almost destroyed the country. He may have realized that we were one nation. And if you read Jefferson's first inaugural address with this in mind, you get a very different understanding. Thomas Jefferson, I think it's a heartfelt, this address has been treated as a political document. I think it's heartfelt. Jefferson writes, "We must unite in common efforts for the common good." He says that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that will to be rightful must be reasonable. That the minority, he's now talking about the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton, the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. Jefferson, in that inaugural address, speaks specifically to the partisanship of the 1790s. He says political intolerance is as despotic, as wicked, and capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions as religious intolerance. Thomas Jefferson is the first president that realizes that what unites us is more important than what divides us, and that the critical job of the president is to speak for the entire nation. But that then leads to this third question. What about Patrick Henry? Most Americans have heard of Patrick Henry, but if they know anything about Patrick Henry, they only remember 7 words he spoke at St. John's Church in 1775, "Give me liberty and peace." And this is truly inadequate. Patrick Henry, even Thomas Jefferson says, Patrick Henry gave the first impulse to the ball of revolution. It was Patrick Henry, when the Stamp Act was passed in Parliament, and it looked like America was going to acquiesce. Benjamin Franklin said, "We don't like it, but I guess we have to live with it." Patrick Henry stands up and gives his "Caesar had his Brutus" speech, appearing to threaten regicide. It's Patrick Henry who gives that liberty or death speech 4 weeks before Lexington and Concord. "Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle?" And "Give me liberty or give me death" became a slogan that was used throughout the war. Patrick Henry is the first governor of the state of Virginia, the largest by land, by population, by wealth. Patrick Henry has a critical role in relieving the suffering at Valley Forge. Patrick Henry is the one that tells George Washington about the Conway Cabal, seeking to replace George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. It's Patrick Henry who sends George Rogers Clark to the Northwest Territories, why we have Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin as states. Patrick Henry becomes the leading anti-federalist in the ratification debates, which is probably responsible for the Bill of Rights. In the 1770s and the 1780s, Patrick Henry would have been on everyone's list of one of the leading founders of the country. And yet all we remember is those 7 words. Why is that? Well, I think there's several reasons. But one, a very important one, is that Patrick Henry is directly and viciously attacked by his political opponents, not only during his life, but for years after his death. It is said of Patrick Henry, he is all tongue without either head or heart. What we have to do is devoutly pray for his death. He's avaricious and rotten-hearted. He read nothing. He had no books. He wrote nothing. He could not write. In his heart, he preferred low society. His legal reasoning is not worth a copper. Henry wanted personal courage. He's a coward. His 2 great passions were the love of money and of fame. George Wythe, the great legal scholar of the 18th century, absolutely refused to sign his law license. And worst of all, he had contempt and hatred for George Washington. All of these things are said by Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson can't give it up. Years after Henry's dead, he continues to tell these stories. In 1824, a young Martin Van Buren, future president of the United States, comes to see Jefferson in Monticello, and Jefferson's reporting these stories. And Van Buren believes it. He's told by Thomas Jefferson that Patrick Henry was a coward, that Patrick Henry was avaricious. And this gets reported in the press. Thomas Jefferson tells these things to Patrick Henry's great biographer, William Wirt. He tells Daniel Webster, a young rising politician, that Patrick Henry is incompetent. Now, we know that many of these things are silly. In fact, in the 20th century, somebody found a copy of Patrick Henry's law license in the archives of some county. It was signed by George Wythe. The idea that he had contempt and hatred for George Washington, the story I started out with, they were very close. They had great admiration for each other. The idea that he couldn't read and write, now, he doesn't have Thomas Jefferson's library, nobody does. Patrick Henry had an excellent library by 18th century standards. He could read Greek and Latin, and he wrote in both Greek and Latin. But these stories that Jefferson told had an impact. They get passed down. Jeffersonians said that Patrick Henry was senile, he was jealous, he was a religious fanatic. My favorite is the Aurora, the Jeffersonian newspaper in Philadelphia, the leading Jeffersonian newspaper in the country. In early 1799, they wrote about Patrick Henry, that he was venerable. His reputation is alike pure and his talents conspicuous. After that March speech that we talked about, they say this of Patrick Henry. He is in the insuspicious temper of a second childhood. It has made him a dupe. He drag his aged limbs and break his wind. He farts. They're telling fart jokes about Patrick Henry. And the Jeffersonians passed this down through the years. After the Civil War, Edward Pollard, another name that some of you may recognize, the man who brings us the lost cause, the myth the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, is a great Jeffersonian because of nullification, and he hates Patrick Henry because of this. He writes an essay in the 1870s saying that Patrick Henry wasn't even a very good speaker, which is absurd. Even Jefferson concedes he's one of the greatest speakers of all times. Well, why is this? You take a step back. This all relates to, it's not the 1799 campaign, it's actually Jefferson's time as governor. You'll recall Patrick Henry is the first governor of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson is the second governor of Virginia. Jefferson has the misfortune that while he's governor, the British invade, and Jefferson's Virginia government is chased out of Richmond to Charlottesville, and you will recall that they're chased out of Charlottesville to Stanton. When that occurs, Thomas Jefferson's term as governor has technically expired by about 2 days. And he writes the Speaker of the House of the General Assembly, and he says, look, I'm eligible for a third term. Don't elect me for a third term as governor. There's redcoats all over the state. Get somebody with military experience. And Jefferson is not a person with military experience. And in fact, when the legislature gets to Stanton, their first act is to elect Lewis Nelson Jr. as the new governor of the state of Virginia. Very interesting. He's the only non-Confederate governor who actually commands the state's troops in the field during war. Lewis Nelson leads the troops from Virginia at Yorktown. That's the first thing the Virginia General Assembly does. The second thing the Virginia General Assembly does is they launch an investigation of Thomas Jefferson. Because Thomas Jefferson, when they were fleeing from Charlottesville over the mountain to Stanton, Thomas Jefferson takes his family and goes to his home in Poplar Forest in Lynchburg. And it appears that the governor has abandoned the state of Virginia. He is accused of dishonor, he is accused of cowardice, and he is accused of incompetence. And that investigation, which is launched, Thomas Jefferson blames on Patrick Henry. Now, history is not entirely clear as to who was responsible for that investigation. Many historians, John Kukla, Peter Olaf, said, no, they don't think it was Patrick Henry. I think it probably was Patrick Henry. It doesn't matter. Thomas Jefferson believed it was Patrick Henry. Thomas Jefferson writes James Monroe, the mere investigation inflicted a wound on my spirit which will only be cured by the all-healing grave. I mean, even for Jefferson, this is over the top. Now, the investigation is dismissed after the victory at Yorktown, but Jefferson can't let it go until the all-healing grave takes him. And so until Jefferson dies in 1826, he takes every opportunity to trash Patrick Henry's reputation. Now, it's sort of interesting, you know, we sometimes see these founders as if they're marble statues on a pedestal, but they're in fact just people, and sometimes they didn't like each other, just like people. Okay, so I've been talking for a while. You know, when you go to graduate school in history, the great question for a graduate student in history is, so what? So what? Fascinating story you're telling, but does it matter? Why do we care about this story? I think there are a number of so whats to this story. First, so what? Thomas Jefferson was absolutely correct about the reign of witches. We have to have a free press and we have to have free speech to make the democracy work. Anyone who tells you that the media is the enemy of the American people is in fact an enemy to the American experiment in democracy. Second, so what? States' rights can go too far. Patrick Henry is the intellectual godfather of the states' rights movement, but he realized that the states cannot nullify federal law. Governor Abbott of Texas has become fond of quoting Thomas Jefferson's 1798 Kentucky resolutions, either not knowing or not caring what happened, and believing that the state of Texas could ignore federal law, at least as long as Biden was president. Third, so what? Henry was right about what do you do as a loyal opposition. Henry had opposed the Constitution. He thought the federal government was too powerful. He thought that it was too distant from the people. He warned people that it would interfere with your rights. But the answer is not ignoring the Constitution or in revolution. In fact, he was asked at Charlotte Courthouse, don't the people have a right to revolution? You led the revolution. Henry says, you only have the right to revolution if you have no political right of redress. You go to the ballot box.
Amen.
You go to the ballot box. Fourth, so what, is the impact on our remembered history. History is not just lived, it's also written. And Thomas Jefferson, living long after Patrick Henry is dead, has an enormous impact on that history. And today, as I mentioned, Patrick Henry is remembered only for those 7 words at St. John's in Richmond, give me liberty or give me death. And this is very unfortunate. Patrick Henry has become a favorite of the Tea Party movement. Liberty uber alles, as if that's the only thing that mattered. If one understands Patrick Henry's 1799 campaign, where he comes out to defend the Constitution that he had opposed, because we, the people, had adopted it. Patrick Henry understands the absolute essential character of community. So with that, I've been speaking for a long time, but I'd be very interested in if you all have any questions.
Well, I have something to say.
Yeah, so this is the Farmington Historical Society. This is not the Farmington Contemporary Political Society. So let's try to keep your questions to the topic. All right, thank you. Question. Oh, Rick. Another historian.
John, great talk. You're a fantastic speaker. When was it finally learned that Jefferson and Madison had penned the resolutions?
So it's a very good question, because the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions are adopted by the Kentucky legislature, the Virginia legislature. They don't have Madison and Jefferson's names on them. It's not formally known until I think about 1815, 1816, but everybody knew. I mean, Washington knows. That's why he's writing Henry. They know that Jefferson and Madison are behind them.
But the general public did.
Not necessarily the general public. I mean, there's actually an interesting incident because Jefferson thought Madison's resolutions were too weak. And so Jefferson actually, and this is fascinating because neither Jefferson or Madison are in the legislature. And so they're having a battle between them through surrogates. So Jefferson gets a surrogate to introduce the null, void of no force and effect language into the Virginia resolutions. Madison gets one of his surrogates to oppose that. And so everybody knows that it's Jefferson and Madison pulling these strings, but it's not public information until much later. It's a good question.
Heather, right here.
Oh. Here we go. Just a minute, Heather.
You don't think I don't. Was there any discussion of repealing the Sedition Act?
It's a very good question. The Federalists were smarter than that. So should we repeal the Sedition Act? The Sedition Act, by its terms, expired on March 3rd, 1801, the day before inauguration of the new president, because you don't want to give the new president the right to have people thrown in jail for sedition. And of course, if John Adams had won, they could simply re-up the act. So there was no need to repeal it. It disappears. Thomas Jefferson, as president, actually pardons everyone who had been convicted under the Sedition Act, because he says this is wrong, this is unconstitutional. But the act disappears. The Alien Acts are still in the books, and I won't talk about politics, but some of them are being relied upon today.
Thank you, John. We all know how difficult the American Revolution was, and thank God we won, which was really, looking at the history of it, it's kind of surprising. But all these new acts that came into place, how much did it play of how difficult the revolution was, and how there was so little food, and entire towns were taken down, and women and children were killed, and all the men had to go to war? So how much did that play into all of the new acts and the states' rights?
This is a very good question. It's a very good point. It's very hard for us to understand where they were in the 1790s. The revolution had been devastating. People have been devastated. The country is new. They're still trying to figure it out. The idea of a loyal opposition, they didn't know what that was. And so, yes, the Federalists, we shouldn't vilify the Federalists too much because they adopted the Sedition Act. They were concerned that this quasi-war with France was going to literally result in Napoleon invading France. And having been through the revolution, there was real fear. At one point in Philadelphia, there were 10,000 people in the streets in a riot. John Adams, in what was the president's house at that time, has guns brought in, has muskets brought into the president's house because they were afraid that the mobs were going to storm the president's house. So the fragility, it's very hard for us to understand the fear, the fragility, the difficulty, and that's why this is just a very contingent period. And that's why Jefferson and Madison, the Alien and Sedition Acts, obviously wrong. In fact, John Marshall says this was a bad idea. He doesn't think it's unconstitutional, but he says this was a bad idea. Jefferson and Madison realize not only it's wrong, but from their perspective it's unconstitutional, but they come up with this crazy Kentucky-Virginia resolution response, and then they realize that went too far. So again, the contingency, the difficulty, the complexity, absolutely, that's all playing into it.
Another question? Right there?
Oh,
A mic is in my face. Thank you again, because the only 7 words or 6 that I knew growing up in Pennsylvania. This is a global question. And we all hear democracy is messy. Democracy is, there's no real, at least to this point, it's not finite, right? But yet we have, and I was like, couldn't wait to get here to hear about Patrick Henry, because I'm like, what? Washington took him out of retirement. He was against the Constitution. So the global question is, this could be not just now. This could be the whole panoply of the marching steps of democracy and who we are as a country. And will it ever be neat? No, I mean, will it ever be, or is just the sheer nature of democracy messy and an experiment?
I tell people, I didn't realize when I started to write this book that I was writing about current events. Here's part of my answer to you. When I vote, the person I vote for doesn't always win. I don't know about you, but they don't always win. This is an essential element of democracy. The person you support is going to lose sometime. And as you say, this is a continuing problem. The fundamental question is, what do you do when the person you support loses? And back to the contingency and the complexity, that sounds like an obvious question. They really hadn't figured it out. And so for Henry to stand up and say, look, sometimes you lose. Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee talks about this. Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee is actually one of the men who's connecting George Washington and Patrick Henry, because he's good friends with both. So no, this isn't going to end. I mean, this is endemic in the system, that sometimes you lose. But what Henry figures out, and I think Jefferson and Madison realized, as I said, I think they realized they had gone too far. You have to be an opposition when the government does things you disagree with, but you have to be a loyal opposition, which means you operate within that system.
One more question right here.
Right here.
Question, a statement. John, in Georgia, I've given 5 of your books away. Patrick Henry, devotee. Most people don't know 2 of his direct descendants live here in Albemarle County. His family in Southwest Virginia, Fincastle, the Christian family, Douthid, Robert Douthid, Meade wrote the definitive 2-volume, basically wrote that to defend the memory of Henry. Do I tell these people that we now in Jefferson's bedroom understand Henry and who he was? Can we appreciate that? You've done a great job. I'm putting that forward.
Thank you very much, John.
Patrick Henry has 17 children, so he's got a lot of descendants. But it's nice to rehabilitate Patrick Henry.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.